Good morning.
Morning, Anthony, and everyone everywhere here now. Gabe is coming in. Gabe, good morning.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
Hey, Anthony.
So what's today going to be for us in this regard? Anything?
If I can just interrupt a little bit, I'm happy. So whatever you guys want to talk about, I'm good.
Well, that doesn't seem to be a lacking. That's an abundant quality, Anthony.
Let me just interrupt you for a second.
Things are surprisingly stable for me right now.
Yeah.
Well, let's figure out what's wrong then.
Well, maybe it's a better time to talk about the nature that's beyond the things we think are good or bad.
Yeah.
Because it's often those things that are the distractions that give us the impression that that's the only thing happening. And so we become consumed with those ideas, thinking that thinking about them is in fact reality.
Well, I'm seeing it firsthand with me cleaning up. I have to clean my garage, and there's things I just think I can't. And I'm like, all you gotta do is pick it up and move it. I'm like, I can't do that. I can't pick it up. There's nowhere for it to go. And I realized I just pick it up just to see what happens and move. It's just mental block, not just mental obsession. But then I do it, and I'm like, oh my God, it really worked. It's like my head tells me every reason why I can't clean this.
But rather than the garage, Anthony, that we're not in right now, here,
Well, I'm gonna be in it in a minute, but yeah.
but here,
Yeah.
where we are, the idea was if enough is well, not to be preoccupied by all the things we think we need to pay attention to fix and are consumed by.
Yeah.
If enough is well right now, it might be worth taking this time, which is really the purpose of this discussion, to consider the absolute nature of existence, not just yours and mine and ours, but everything's.
Yeah, I like that.
So, Gabe, you were talking about stability. My experience has been that I will create instability to the degree that I'm making believe my thoughts will someday become true. I have that wishful pink cloud imagination that if I think harder about something, it's going to fix it. When in fact, that tends to drive me into deeper, darker, isolated experiences. And it's all this idea that if I can do something that's wrong and turn it into right, I am now really powerful. And I now have the power. And now I can begin to operate in this world and get everything that I thought I wanted. And yet it just doesn't seem to happen that way on the basis of that thinking, because that addictive idea about turning something wrong into right. If something's wrong, it's wrong. That's it. And what does that mean to us as humans? It doesn't work. There's no application for it other than frustration and the confounded nature of being confused over what we're trying to do and never seem to be getting it done. We're trying, but it never gets done. And so the nature of applying thoughts that align with nature is that they're productive and constructive and useful and gainful and fulfilling as a result, because we know that we recognize quickly that fulfillment, especially in relation to the emptiness we often experience in that attempt to turn what's wrong into right or what's false into truth. It's all just a mental gyration that we've committed to. And my experience seems to tell me this has been going on as long as humans began to develop that cognitive ability to actually think about their thinking. I suspect in the early days when humans were being chased by dragons and sloths that were 2,000 pounds, they weren't doing a lot of worrying about the future. But today, where we have so much abundance and so much potential and so much seeming control over the resources, we seem to be breaking down mentally, somehow thinking more thinking is going to solve the problem rather than start to come to terms with the absolute nature of our existence, which we're obviously capable of considering. If nothing else, considering it would be simply suspending judgment for a second. And it isn't really a suspension of judgment. It's a suspension of condemnation about the thought, because judgment is typical for a brain to do. But when I think my thoughts are real, I think judgment means contempt and spite and shutting off and shutting down and resisting and fighting and isolating my experience from the potential of growing beyond the limits of the thoughts that I'm constantly thinking I need to defend to protect myself, which is a self born purely out of imagination, not reality. So if there is a shared essence, that's our essence. And if we talk about it, my experience has been it begins to actually offer an experience compared to thinking I can turn right into wrong. I begin to have an experience that there's actually something profoundly available when I'm not so desperately trying to find the answer to an unanswerable question, which is, why can't I turn wrong into right? Because I don't have wrong is wrong. I think it's going to be right. I'm already creating an inner conflict, which is kind of like thinking we shouldn't be where we are right now, or I don't have what I want right now, when in fact, in every moment, I'm always where I am physically as a human, and I always have everything that I have wherever I am all the time. If I think I shouldn't be here and should be somewhere else, it's an impossibility, because the somewhere else will always be a present state of awareness. Wherever I go, wherever I get, whatever I have, whatever I do, it will always be, that presence will always be with us. And that, I would say, is the ultimate essence of our capacity. So if it's always there and always available and we're not always utilizing it, it's the thinking we're doing about it that's the problem. It isn't it isn't life, it isn't right, it isn't wrong, it isn't reality, it isn't truth. It's none of those things. It's the thinking about it that we're doing. I don't know if any of you guys read through that definition of cancer by the doctor last week.
No.
So his description of a cancer cell beginning to find itself isolated and then thinking the best thing it can do is start to create more cancer cells to create a community around it, and then continue to do that to the point that it actually, what he didn't get to is that the cancer cell, in fact, is suicidally trying to kill itself, because eventually it kills the host if it is able to replicate sufficiently in a body that is susceptible to it. And I would say anxiety and stress is what wears bodies down to become susceptible. And we've all got the makings of a cancer cell in our body. But if our bodies aren't destabilized, they're naturally healed, because the healthy cells dominate the function of the body. So he was describing when a cancer cell begins to replicate and begins to create this community, we call it a tumor. But the cancer cell is willing to kill itself in the name of survival. And it's exactly what happens in the mentality of making believe all I am is what I think. And then I need to think more about that to figure out why I feel so destabilized and uncomfortable and disheartened and dispirited and uninspired, bored, numb, vacant in my experience. He's basically defining ego as a disease, exactly as the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous announced that the disease of addiction centers in the mind. He's referring to alcoholism, but there are hundreds of programs now based on the 12 steps dealing with all kinds of symptoms that all track back to this exact same problem. We will attach to anything we can become attached to make believe that being consumed by that thing and making believe that that thing has us rather than we have created a experience where we're attempting to avoid responsibility for what we're doing and claim to be victims to it. And that is an insufferable, meaning you can't suffer enough to fix it. It's just an insufferable position to be in. And I would say that is a very common, neurotic, anxious, desperate plea for help. And yet we try wholeheartedly in society to fix the symptom, try to feel better, try to get over it, try to fix it, rather than see that this is actually our body language giving us perfect information. It's the absolute curriculum required. It isn't even required, but it's available if we listen to it accurately rather than think of it as the exact opposite, meaning if I feel bad, that my goal is to feel better, rather than say, why am I'm obviously doing something to feel bad, starting there. And if it's thinking that's bad and I begin to concede that in the process, the nature of nature becomes very obvious quickly, because the limits of my thoughts all of a sudden become the beginning of everything else rather than the end of anything. There's nothing to defend. There's no reactiveness, impulsiveness, or compulsiveness that's going to save me. And it becomes pretty obvious. Morning, Harry.
Morning, Jack.
So we can focus on the misery, or we can simply admit the misery, the frustration, the conflicts, the overwhelming sensations are simply byproducts of attempting to do something that is impossible. And to feel life is impossible as a result of that choice is once again to see how quickly we turn to blaming rather than noting it's our choices that are causing that. And to do this as a disease that seems to be undiagnosed, it would mean it's happening a lot with many people and looks so normal and so common that it couldn't possibly be something I can't do. When in fact, I am choosing individually. The one thing I have within the context of free will means I can choose whatever I can choose. And one of those choices is not choosing at all, which is the interrupter of addiction. The idea that we have no other choice is a lie about choice, because choice always allows not to be chosen. So if that absolute nature is our nature, that would be pretty profound, meaning for finding, rather than questionable, meaning constantly seeking. And humans have been seeking for a long, long time, and apparently have not found what they're looking for, as you too so beautifully spoke. So if that's our nature, how do we talk about it as humans that struggle with that don't always see it as our nature, that don't always think of it as our nature, that don't always concede it is our nature? And think there's some reality somewhere else we need to find when we've never been able to yet. Same thing as, trying more and more heroin to fix it doesn't seem to work for people eventually. Overdosing is a very common cause of constantly seeking, thinking you'll find and not finding. So more and more is required because we become intolerant. We create a tolerance level to it. And I would say that would, in the emotional world, that would be denial and this psychic as a psychic anesthesia, trying to numb the pain we're otherwise feeling and think that because we don't feel it isn't there, when we're freezing up and desensitizing our whole capacity to function as human beings with a being nature. If the nature of nature is natural, it is our nature, period. And there's plenty of evidence in the universe of things that don't think that operate perfectly in relation to their design, what they're here to do. Our purpose in living is living. And I would suggest we're not afraid of death, we're afraid of living. Because we're trying to think of life as something we do rather than something we are. Something we need to get more out of, squeeze the most out of life we can, rather than see we've already been given the totality of life. Now the question is, how well am I utilizing the functional capacity and the functional literacy, literally understanding the body language sufficiently to begin to operate at a level that would be aligned with that absolute awe-inspired nature? So if we can take an hour and a half a week and talk about that, it may be in the midst of looking at it and considering it without having to agree with it or have faith in it or believe in it or have hope in it, because none of those things are required for anything that's absolute, because absolute means guaranteed, no options, no other choice. And the difference with an absolute having no other choice is that you can't be condemned by having been given everything. There's no condemnation in it. Nothing is withheld. There's no limits imposed. There's no requirements. We're not hostage to anything like we seem to be in our own thinking. So ego is an attempt to become God. Beingness is the essence of that power, that source, whatever it is. However we define it, however we think of it, whatever it is despite the thinking we do about it. It just happens to be. And probably doesn't even happen. It's probably just an essential presence that's pure consciousness, uninterruptible, immutable, inviolable, the nature of nature. So again, we can talk about the problems, we can focus on the essence, and by focusing on the essence, I will guarantee you it will bring light to what you thought were dark cracks and crannies in your existence that will disappear in terms of the seeming problems simply because of the willingness to consider something that can seem so absurd and so preposterous and so out of touch and so unreal and so far away and so deep, where all of those words are actually reflecting the thinking we're doing that we think is hidden and buried and we don't have anything to do with. So there is no depth to truth. There is no depth to reality. Any thoughts?
It all makes sense, Jack, but I keep going back.
Yeah.
Keep trying.
Well, consider, Gabe, because this isn't about, if this is absolute, we don't need to understand it for it to be absolute. And beginning to notice that it's our own limits of understanding within the thinking we do, that we keep thinking is going to finally explain it to us, rather than concede and concede and concede and concede the thinking to whatever the thinking is that's limited, to realizing it's still here in its full absolute state of being. It's always here. And so then the question becomes, what am I doing to give myself the impression it isn't? So if it's
I'm doing it every day. I'm trying as hard as I can.
Yeah, well, that may, but the surrender in this case, the concession of it is seeing that we don't have any impact on it, regardless of what we think. It's really beginning to see that this isn't a thing of trying to get there. We've been trying to get there so long, we still think we just need a clearer path and then we'll arrive. Where in fact, the path has never been obstructed, except by the thinking we do about our absolute reliance on thinking as our source. So it seems like a big give because it seems like, or a big take, because it seems like something we've always done. And it seems preposterous to imagine it's something we can stop, because it would seem to threaten the whole existence of the ideas we've had about ourselves and about life and about death and about all the people, places, and things that we've ever considered. You know, I read something over the weekend by someone who said that and it may have been Buddha talking, I forget what he was referring to, but to begin to concede this is actually to begin to face the sadness of the missed moments and the missed opportunities, and start to come to terms with the fact that our memory doesn't forget these things, though we conveniently often think it does, to avoid the impact of seeing with perspective the disadvantages and the dysfunctional interactions that we've engaged in. And the ones we've broken to get away because we think they're toxic and don't notice that it's the toxicity that I'm suffering from. I don't want to admit that I always find objectionable in someone else for as long as I want to admit it or won't admit it in my own experience. So it feels a little demoralizing, doesn't it, Gabe?
Yeah, sometimes, not all the time.
Okay, so let's say the times that it does is an accurate assessment of an immoral thought. If our body language is correct and it's based in nature, it's giving us perfect guidance in relation to our human experience, the life form that we've been given. And our listening now is a mental decision. It's the brain that we're using, which is also part of that body, part of that life form. So if we have freedom of choice and we choose against nature, unnatural ideas and unhealthy ideas, and uneasy ideas and discomforting ideas, and then think that's life, we're missing the impact we have on our own experience to begin to say, oh, why would I even think those things if they're not true? Why would I keep repeating them day in and day out and day in and day out if they aren't true? Why would I do this? Why would I create this experience? Within the context of addiction, it's always about trying to get over what's happening rather than have what's happening. And nobody I know that's ever been addicted to anything ever fixed anything by avoiding it. Nor have I ever seen anything actually accomplished that wasn't done. So our functional capacity is greatly impaired by the idea that, well, all we need to really do is manage this thinking a little better so we feel better all the time and feel happy and look happy and promote the idea that we're happy when in fact we're not. And generally speaking, to look at this as the beginning, as I mentioned about that thing I read over this weekend, was beginning to face the mourning and the grieving of the collection of missed opportunities. When you begin admitting, honestly, what's happening right now, the clarity of all that stuff that we might have thought we couldn't remember and that was no longer happening, so it isn't happening, so we're not thinking about it at all. But it is part of our collective memory because the present moment is actually a collection of everything that's ever happened is actually represented right now in this moment. Every interaction that's ever happened within the universe is the totality of what this moment exists. It exists in this moment. And that's pretty profound when you think that the little things we've done individually with the people we did it with are so objectionable as to think of something we can't even remember and are better forgetting and better being numb to and desensitizing our experience rather than really come to terms with it. And if you think of the steps, this is exactly what the steps are designed to do, which is melt away the objectionable ideas we have about responsibility and accountability and honesty. So if you act that way, you're maintaining those ideas in some way. But to begin to notice that is to begin to take advantage of the dysfunction as a learning curve to begin to develop our actual functional literacy, meaning we're listening to the voices, we're listening to the words, we're listening to the thoughts, and we're beginning to utilize that listening effectively enough to take advantage of it and grow as a result and actually come to terms with what's happening. Most of, I will suggest, what we struggle with are thoughts we don't think we're having and thoughts we don't think we should be having and situations that seem to be condemning us rather than extensions of that same thinking that we're seeing in that way so we can continue to blame everything and everyone else in some way. we can stop the blame immediately to recover from the addiction we're struggling with in the most broad way. But ultimately, emotional sobriety is beginning to do that on a daily basis, a momentary basis, all the time. I was reading through a pamphlet on the four absolutes, and it talked about honesty being the most difficult one because it's not a part-time affair. It's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week process. And I don't need to be right to be honest. And that is a big glaring, one of the defects of imagining I'm okay is thinking that everything I'm doing wrong is fine when it's gnawing at me and eating me up inside and creating the inner conflict and the emotional turmoil and the mental anguish that I'm trying to get away from. So if I'm trying to get away from it and I think I can get away from it, I'm actually getting away with it wherever I go. I might be able to get away from a bank if I rob it, which would be the goal. But when it comes to mental issues, since they center in our brain and they go along with our body and they're part of the body, I take every one of those decisions with me. And if it's corrupt, I'm going to think and feel I'm going to think and feel in corruptible ways and also feel a righteous need to feel better than that because it makes no sense to consider that I'm insane. But I'm actually inducing a sense of insanity that has me operating on the basis of listening to voices in my head and seeing and hearing only what I think people are saying and seeing and hearing only what I think is happening, rather than starting to notice that everything's happening exactly as it's happening all the time. And my interpretation of it doesn't affect anything greater than my own thinking. But it certainly creates an influence on what's happening around me. So I experienced that same stuff, Gabe. I don't talk about this because I don't do it. I talk about it because I want to get better at realizing the capacity I share with everyone. As an exercise of functional literacy. Morning, Jana.
Good morning.
So I kept from talking about this for years because it seemed absurd to me that I should be the one to talk about it because I was waiting for everyone else to start because I thought I would be a lunatic to be able to speak to it. And I had spoken about it for quite some time before I actually decided to do it more publicly and openly, which became a greater challenge because the absurdity of it became more immediate, more obvious. The absurdity of maintaining this old position that somehow I need to keep it to myself until everybody else changes, and then I'd be happy to talk, rather than see that the freedom I have to do what I want to do is free. And if that's the case, and there's something that seems worthy of doing, that might as well be the thing I do and act on and think about. And within sobriety, I'm sober 37 years. That seemed to me the core of the reprieve, of the idea of being free from addiction, was starting to realize that there's the addictive tendency of the brain, thinking about thinking as myself, starts with the idea that I think my thoughts are reality. So when I'm facing problems that are really just thoughts that think there's a problem that I have induced, they are nothing more than I make of them at any given moment. But beginning to let that go is to face the fear I've been building, the tension I've been building, the pressure I've been building in my body, and actually start to allow that to melt, which is where this thing I read over the weekend, yesterday, I think made that point, that there's a lot of grief in it and a lot of mourning in it, because there's been moments where the fullness of the potential for us to be with people at our best, offering the most we could possibly offer, becomes very obvious. We've been wounded knowing better the whole time while we've been acting as though everything's fine. And that's a nice little rhyme this time. My experience, it's the thoughts I don't think I'm having that are causing the seeming deeper impact because of the thoughts I'm trying to hide to keep from admitting I'm the one causing the problems. And so if I feel disconcerted, I know that I'm thinking things that are disconcerted. I'm discontent. That thought has no content. There's no substance in it. There's no reality other than my thinking about my thinking. And that isn't reality. That's just a conclusion that because I can think, that whatever I think of is right. Once I think my thinking is reality. It's interesting that we all have arms and legs, and I don't know anybody who goes around and says, I'm just a left arm. I'm just a right foot. And yet we do it when it comes to thinking. We have thinking, we can think, we do think, and yet we think it's us. If it was us, we wouldn't have it, we wouldn't do it. We would be it. So the being nature is in a relation with the human nature. And to talk about that openly is to begin to put things in order, because the being nature preceded the human and will exceed the human, because it's not a time and space bound dimension. So if we can talk about it, which sometimes we do, I would say well, and sometimes we do a little less than well, but whatever we do, we're doing. And to look at what we're doing at any given moment, whether it be thinking about it as something in the past, but thinking about it always in the present, is a chance to start noticing how well we're being, which is well-being. And if we're sick and don't feel well, it's coming from the thinking. It's not coming from the being. Being is offering us an absolute steady, stable basis in life because it is the source of life. And the human form, the life form, is in a process, apparently. That seems relative, but when you begin seeing it accurately, it's easy to begin to recognize that it has absolute traits very visibly revealed when you're thinking about it correctly and wholly, rather than in parts and pieces as though they're independent of the whole. Harry, thanks for your text last week.
You're welcome, Jack. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Sorry, getting a little water. How are things back in Chicago?
Everything's good. Yeah, the weather isn't too bad, but still missing California.
Yeah. I'm not. So any thoughts on what we're talking about today, or I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think you just said about noticing the thinking. It took me about a year and a year and a half to realize that, because I thought I could beat my thinking, because I never wanted to surrender. But one day I woke up, I was like, what's going on? Nothing's changing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I should try something else. And then and once I noticed that, week by week, I track my, I started to notice that the change, it wasn't the same. So I started to actually listen to you more, because because I always thought I was right, even when I was wrong. I just didn't. Yeah, because you have more knowledge than me. Because I was like, I knew I was wrong, but I just never wanted to surrender.
Well, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and but once I started to notice that, I started to change, and I'm still, it's a process. I'm still improving. It's not it's because sometimes I think I'm already done with this, but it's a process, and I understand it. About 2 days ago, I went through. Last week, I think I texted you.
Yeah.
About being. I mean, it wasn't really bad, but every time I'm there, I come out with more knowledge. But now, every time I'm in this dark thought, I don't see it as being bad. I see it as, oh, this is my opportunity to gain more knowledge. I see it as I just see it as like that. I don't get scared anymore, but I see them. Okay, here we go again. What can we learn now? And it takes sometimes it takes me 1, 2, 3 days to get out of there, but I come up with more knowledge, and here I am. It just I feel better now, but
No, it's a very different talking to you recently than when we had our first conversation. And I forget when that was exactly, but the time wise, yeah. But I think you have a pretty good idea.
Yeah, I actually listened to that first part, the first time that I spoke to you on here. That was June 19. And I actually.
What year was it, Harry?
June 19, Sunday.
What year?
2022.
Yeah, so it was a couple of years back.
Yeah,
year and a half. Yeah. So let me make a few points on what you're saying. I don't have any more knowledge than you do when it comes to an intuitive, inspired wisdom that would be the all-knowing nature of nature. We have the same. What differs is, and what even differs in my own experience, is how I think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have something in common, you and I and everyone else, and I start thinking in those terms, I all of a sudden have no one else to blame. And I can see the central focus of what I thought was a heroic attempt to save myself was the exact same thing that I was trying to save a self that didn't exist. It was just a thinking about thinking itself as myself. So my contemplative capacity to imagine things possible turned into a detrimental contemplative possibility of thinking only about the impossibility of being right when I'm wrong, is trying to insist that everything in the world and universe change to accommodate my wrong thought, to turn it into right. That's a pretty big job. So I go through that all day long to a degree. And to Gabe's point, my sense is the problems that I originally thought were the ones that were really plaguing me became nothing once I started noticing what I was doing. But the problems that I see today are more cultural ideas I have about how things are, when in fact, if there's any conflict in my experience about those things, society, how people are, how humans are, what human nature is, what life is about, if there's any failure in my thinking about those things accurately, that's what I'm struggling with. That's what is the sense of depression, the sense of alienation, the sense of disconnection, the sense of lack of power. All those kind of things come from those ideas that I think about now much more. Used to be I had a lot of hidden ideas, and they generally had to do with everybody around me. And as I started speaking more honestly to people, that disappeared. And the more subtle issues became more obvious because, as you were mentioning, Gabe, you still wake up and still see this tendency. If we have been doing this as a species for thousands of years, and it's been left undiagnosed, just like alcoholism was largely undiagnosed until the 1900s, in the same form that makes it possible for people today who are willing and interested and ready to admit their disease, possible for them to get sober. That lasted throughout history. Drunks were thought of as people who were disposable. Lock them up, throw them away, kill them, get rid of them. They have no place in society because they can't seem to function in any beneficial way. But if this thinking has been going on that long, certainly we've inherited cultural values that seem to be intrinsic and things that can't change, when in fact all they are is wrong ideas being thought to be right still. right now. So to have a little awareness is to see it all clearly and start realizing that there are many, many disturbing things happening around us that are actually disturbing, not just the disturbing way we're seeing those things. Starting to look accurately, you can see that people are hurting, people are struggling, people are suffering. There is something that can be done, but nothing that will be done if we pretend that everything's fine in our own existence and I don't need to go beyond the boundaries of this limited idea that I have about who I am and what I think. So I'm constantly trying to perfect that comfort level by having more and more of things that never seems to be enough and get to a place that I can't ever seem to find because I deny the place I'm in where I am right now. To think reality's out there somewhere is to think right now there's no reality here. And to think reality is limited in any way is simply to be stuck in a thought, thinking wrongly that it's right. Just as you described, Harry.
Can I say something else, Chuck?
Please.
Yeah. I was so used to getting away from my fears.
Right.
And at some point, if you listen to the first meeting, every single fear came back to me at the same time. It's just I couldn't get away from them anymore. And I started to, like you said a few months ago, embrace what is happening to you, and I started doing that too as well. I stopped running away from those fears, and I saw some changes, and it really helped too.
Well, interestingly, looking at history, I mean, the idea again of trying to get away from it immediately says that the effect of it is the problem, rather than seeing that you are both starting it and now taking a position that you're going to end it without admitting you started it. If you admitted you started it, you would say there's nothing to end if I don't start it.
Yeah.
You know, this obsession is kind of like deciding to get somewhere, getting the map out, and there's an accident, and all of a sudden on the freeway there's a bunch of traffic, and you still want to do the speed the original message told you, or the original map told you. So what are you going to get? Into a collision. You're going to end up without a car. You're going to end up without mobility. You're going to end up not getting where you are. And it's the same thing in our thinking, that when we begin to implode around these ideas and feel the depressing nature of that implosion, it's evidence that we're simply thinking something. We don't need to even know the thing we're thinking. That's of no consequence whatsoever, because it's all just imagined. It's made up to give us a story to make believe that somehow we're going to fix it if the story gets better. And one of the things I've learned in here is that if you interrupt somebody who's telling an immoral story, they get really pissed. And there's a few episodes where people got really angry and disconnected.
Yeah. I would just do anything to get away. Like I would go shopping. That would just give me pleasure for a few hours, maybe 1 or 2 days. I would just eat a lot. That was every time I was anxious, I would I wanted to eat anything. I would not get full, but I just wanted to eat more and more. But at some
point, you can see the compulsive nature revealing in those seeming attachments that we're trying to cling to prove we have control.
Yeah.
It's interesting. We try to prove we have control over things that are out of control. It's exactly what addiction is. So, Harry, you're also describing that fear of how do I get out of this? How do I stop this? The fear that comes from that is coming from the idea that the only thing to be done is to stop it rather than take responsibility for starting it. And see that you can't escape it as long as you maintain it. The idea of escaping it, you think there's actually something to escape, where when you begin to see insane ideas are just ideas thought to be real, there's nothing to run from. Because as soon as you see that, it just starts to dissipate immediately. And that exposure literally exposes us to all the stuff that's built into our body's tension that is representing some form of an idea that we're still clinging to that is causing stress and anxiety in our body. And the memory isn't limited to the brain. It's in the cells of the entire body. The stress in the muscles and all the things, the organs, everything that is it's metaphorically or instantaneously reflecting that manifesting. It's actually manifesting the tension by constricting our body, the blood flow, all of the things that would be healthy start to stop in our own experience. So as you start thinking healthy, you start witnessing the fact that your body's been under an enormous amount of stress and fear, and you begin to see that fear. And I remember early on, Harry, you said, I'm starting to feel worse. You remember that?
Yeah, but yeah.
Because in the beginning of looking at it, all of a sudden it's like a tidal wave that you've been working to avoid and get away from, while you've been building it quietly as though you weren't doing anything about it. So it was growing while you thought you were escaping. The stuff is going on. It's going on in our brain. It's not going on in a lake somewhere where we're floating a boat and trying to keep it up because it's leaking. It's in our brain. We're taking it with us. Wherever our body goes, it goes with us.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, lately I've been thinking about that. And remember the text that I sent you a few weeks ago about being angry? I mean, being angry.
Yeah.
It's just for Thanksgiving I went to LA. And I got really angry. Why? I wasted so much time. Why was I like that all the time? It's just like it just wasn't real. Whatever was in my head, it wasn't real. It was like a nightmare.
It is a manifestation, though, because I want to make a point while you're on that point. If I'm thinking about time I wasted, the pain and sorrow is coming from the thought I'm having right now while I'm wasting time thinking about a time that isn't happening. You follow that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think of it as something back there that happened then and it's over there, it's not now, when in fact I'm doing the exact same thing now, wondering why I feel so acutely pain over these other things. I'm using them as an excuse to avoid looking at, I'm doing it right now. I'm wasting time thinking about something that isn't happening right now in this moment. And I think it's what I did in the past that's causing that, rather than what I'm doing in the present about that thing in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if we're talking in principled terms, we're looking at the absolute nature of nature as always being present and being the absolute present awareness of all knowledge and all power, real power, not this implied power that a lie someday will become truth. And when I finally get it there, I will be the creator of reality.
Yeah.
And thinking that way would typically put humans at great odds with one another. And if you look at society, it's pretty easy to see that that's happening and has been happening through written history.
Yeah. I was so addicted to overthinking. I was so addicted to being in my head. It's been over. It's just.
Well, and thinking that you're being in your head rather than you have a head that's thinking that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Starting to actually look at, we use words that if they're looked at accurately tell us what we're doing exactly, but we think of the connotation of what we're saying as meaning something else, which is another very divisive, clever, cunning, deceitful attempt to make believe that we have nothing to do with it. And it's just this thing happening so randomly. And we've been given full control over this body we have. You don't have a thought to get up in the morning and all of a sudden I bounce out of bed.
Mm-hmm.
It's your body that you have that control over. And yet we all share the same basic DNA. And I mean, almost to the identical, the variations between us are slim. Even between species, they're narrow because the basic life form operates on the same basis, blood and oxygen and all of the different sensory organs. Some operate differently than we do, but they're all attempts to monitor and assess what's happening to make the best decisions for survival, to eat, to stay warm, to be comfortable. Those are all intuitive guidance systems, instincts. So the instinct of a sick thought, like this doctor talked about that we discussed last week, and it's in the subtext of last week's, I think it was CV 105, the episode, where it's written there, the basic idea that he discussed in terms of how this cancer cell begins to develop and multiply, creates a neighborhood of cancer cells that are called a tumor. But it's killing the host in the process. It's killing the environment. It's trying to survive, but killing the environment it's trying to survive in. It's exactly what happens to us as humans when we think we can't take it anymore and think that suicide's the only way out. Think of the disease thinking in a physical form is exactly the same thing in this mental form, because the mentality we have is in the physical form. The brain is in the body. The brain isn't the mind. The mind is a capital M, capital I, capital N to capital D. It's a absolute nature. It's an all-knowing nature. It isn't a thinking nature. It isn't an understanding nature. And it's also not a misunderstanding or a misthinking nature. It's a knowing nature. It doesn't have any need to think because it knows everything. Doesn't need to know the circumstances we're in to know everything, because the circumstances we create are simply manifestations and transformations of reality. They're not creations of reality. They're manifestations they're transformations of existing reality. We just influence things in our environment and think we've created reality. We haven't. We've utilized reality fully. So to think otherwise is not wise. The idea that humans are greedy and hateful and spiteful and contemptful all comes from thinking that this sick mental nature is our nature. And if you listen to many people discuss it, that's the basis of the contention. It's gone on so long we take for granted it's natural, but nothing abnormal can be normalized without great effort.
And can we just take a moment to appreciate Harry's honesty? His life changing.
I hope so.
Yeah, I could hear it. Thank you for your honesty.
Oh yeah, one more thing. I actually I listened to the first meeting. I think you were there too, Anthony. June 19, 2022. I actually
Yeah,
remember
and
your
how
voice.
awesome you are. Just take a moment to appreciate you.
Yeah, I actually remember your voice. I was like, wow, I think I heard this before. And then Jack told me to just listen to the first meeting, and then yeah, you were actually there too.
So Anthony, in response to your, or Gabe, in response to your original thing, I don't know if you read the announcement this week, but one of Buddha's quotes is, "Truth is still true even if no one believes it. A lie is still a lie even if everyone believes it." So to Harry's point and to your generosity, Anthony, in acknowledging it, it's starting to contend with this fact within the context of the lying that we're doing. There's no discomfort in truth. There's no disruption or discomforting aspects of peril or
Did
fear.
you just say you're doing a line, Jack? Is that what you said? The line that you're doing. Lie that you're doing. Oh, sorry.
Lie. So the discomforting aspects and the disassociation and all of the attempts to escape are all from a lie that we're continuing to create. So to come to terms with that seems overwhelming at first. But if we can think of it in total terms, rather than this person and this situation and that thought and all that kind of stuff, just start to see that the totality of it is being given to us as the feelings we're having, because think about feeling guilty. Guilt isn't a feeling. We're feeling the guilt for the doing that we're doing. And shame, they tend to be two of the most common feelings. They're not feelings. They're our bodies sensing the guilt for the choices we're making and the shame for the feelings we're having as a result. We're ashamed of
You're
those
saying
things.
it's more than a feeling, is what you're saying. It's not just a feeling. It's you. It is you. It's not a feeling. It's more
I'm
than
saying if we ascribe it to an emotion, which it isn't, we're missing the fact that feeling is capable of feeling and sensing. Feeling is about our senses. We have senses in our body. We're sentient beings in terms of our human experience. Our body is designed to give us information to help us make the best choices, not just for our own experience, but when I'm making the best choice for me, ultimately, in my own human experience, I'm making the best thing I can do for everyone. I'm doing the best thing I can do. Doesn't mean I'm doing anything for them directly, but I'm creating an example of what can be done by everyone. That's ultimately, if I'm doing it for Harry, for instance, I'm not giving Harry the chance to start to work this out and say, oh, I do have a nature that's very clear, and I can disrupt it very quickly. And I can notice the disruption as something that I'm doing rather than something I think is happening to me. And as I start thinking of it in terms that are accurately, or anyone, the diminishment of the impact begins to dissolve rather than be resolved over and over and over and over and over again. There's nothing wrong with resolution, but the point is, if we're talking about imagination as reality, there's nothing really there other than what we continue to maintain we think is there. We think it's the problem. We think the story's the problem. We're the ones that are continuing to tell the story to have the problem. Pretty convenient that we would be the ones creating it and then bemoaning it, acting self-pitifully. Think about that. Self-pity is basically a pitiful self crying for attention, trying to have everybody else do for them what they're unwilling to do in their own experience. Begging, pleading. Think of intimate relationships often. The person often is giving them something they don't think they have. So what are they doing? Basically holding that person hostage to get it from them because they don't think without them they can live and survive. Murder-suicide is popular in that dimension. People think there's no escape from that. Or we can all think there's no escape from that by making believe it's truth and reality. It's not. It's conjured thinking. That's it. It's an apparition, actually, like a ghost. So to feel haunted and feel the fear is actually to begin to witness what you're creating, what you're manifesting. And to see it as something we can do is to also see it as something we have no requirement to continue to do. And to see it continue to happen, I would suggest just as evidence that we're still thinking things we don't think are true, that we think are true that aren't true.
Yeah, but
And
every time when Harry says the whole experience, it makes me feel it all over again. So I appreciate that. It's just amazing. Like I can feel it with him as his voice sounds beautiful. He doesn't sound. I could hear it in your voice. You sound like amazing, a Christmas miracle.
Well, the idea that it's a miracle when it's natural, the real miracle is that we think disease is normal. We think healing is a miracle, which it isn't.
Well, do you know why disease is normal? Actually, I hate to be fighting already, but you know why disease is normal and why it's important?
I can imagine.
Because if the human body lasted for 1,000 years, we would never be able to overcome any problem. If there was the reason the lifespan is only so long is because we have to be able to adapt. If we live thousands of years, it would take thousands of years to change, right? So it is important. It is part of it. We need that.
Well, within the relative universe, everything's always been changing for 14 plus billion years.
Relatively.
So if that's the case, it doesn't seem to be too long for it to be continuing on a natural basis.
Wait, you wouldn't be arguing about it if it was, right? We only argue about things we're not sure about.
I'm not sure this is an argument, but maybe a statement, a question.
There is a reason. It is natural.
Disease?
Yeah.
No, transformation is natural, and that's all.
What if we live for 1,000 years? We would never. We'd be like, okay, it's going to take a long time to change.
But you're sort of committing yourself to only changing at the end of that life form experience rather than at the beginning.
I like that.
Yeah. So if it's all now, Anthony, and the essence of life isn't a body and it isn't in time and space, the whole element of time is irrelevant. How long we spend and how long we have. It's all an arc. It's all a beginning, middle, and end, like a story.
So this show could just go on forever instead of only like 2 hours. It'll be like, it's forever show.
No, it probably seems forever to some.
Not to Katie. She's happy. It's like, it's not long enough.
It's the only 2 hours during the day I'm not talking to her.
Right. She's like, you should do your show longer.
If the nature of our nature is natural and we share it, and Harry, to your
Wait, is that
initial
possible
point,
that it's not natural? You just said if the nature is natural, is it possible it's not?
I want you to continue to explore it not being, Anthony, and see if it helps you resolve any of the issues that you're
Well,
dealing with.
I wanted to feel. Okay.
It's use your own experience
Well,
to
I just like
judge.
to. I'm just looking at every statement. I want to make sure that because the listener, he's like, I don't know if that's right. So I'm trying.
Anthony,
I'm like being the voice.
Anthony, the listener is perfectly capable of making decisions on their own. You are not going to help them in any way if you're not getting to the point where you're actually seeing things clearly enough not to feel so compelled to feel you need to do
Wait,
for
is
them
that
what
true,
they're
Harry?
unwilling to do.
Where's Harry at?
Oh, I'm here.
Okay, let's hear from Harry.
What was that again?
Let's hear about your experience and walk somebody through it. Can you tell? It was so magical. I want to hear that again.
Oh, it'll take me hours.
Can't you sum it up? That's the problem. Can you sum it up in like a little bit, like a minute?
Anthony,
I'm still trying to figure out too what really happened at the
Right? You
beginning.
don't even know. That's the beauty, right? You don't know what happened. And that's
so Anthony, what's your right now impulse to have Harry give you something you think you don't have?
that's just, it doesn't, yeah, that's like, that. If that doesn't happen, we have a problem. That's always the case. Harry described a magical happening and he doesn't know. He just told us he doesn't even know what happened.
Well, he doesn't have to think he knows to be knowing. Knowing
And
doesn't
that's what
think.
I'm getting at. That's where you come in. That's why you're the moderator. You're exactly explaining this.
And why are
Well-
you claiming yourself as a moderator?
Because I want to be right. We need co-moderators in life. That's your theory.
Hardly.
So if we're able to focus a conversation around something absolute and begin to notice all the questionable questions that come up impulsively to try to interrupt the train of thought, it might be worth noting that we're leaving a lot of crumbs on the table that would be very valuable information to take with us when we're done.
It's
For
about
really-
those crumbs. It comes down to food. We need crumbs.
Well, I'm suggesting that the smallest part of this is all of it, so that any of it becomes the totality of it. And to consider it in any way is to begin to consider that there's always more than we think. When we're thinking is the sum total of all that we know. Always. Always. So to question thinking from the thinking that's doubtful is to launch a ship from a doubtful thought, asking a question that you're really not interested in having an answer to, because it would take away the impulse that is driving you in that direction. It would resolve it, and that resolution would be not having an egoistic seeming reality to depend on and try to continue to manicure and shape and turn into something that everybody someday will love when most people don't even notice it. All they noticed are the defective consequences of it and the impacts that they're suffering as a result, not always knowing exactly where it's coming from, but knowing when it arrives that it's there. So we may not have control over everybody else's thinking, but we certainly influence everything by everything we do. And if the basis of our doing is aligned with what's actually happening, it certainly puts us in a position to be able to offer more to many rather than very little other than misery to many at the same time, especially to the people closest to us, which are probably our best gauges. And I would say it would be secondary to the gauge of this sense of dysfunction and this sense of disconnection and this sense of fear that comes that can seem so consuming that we have to get away from it or we're going to die, when in fact the life we're trying to protect doesn't have any life at all. It's just a thought with no substance, parading as reality, parading as appearing to be something like forms. We're life forms. Forms aren't substantive in their superficial state. They're substantive because there's much to them that is unseen. And yet we know it's there and it's working right now. The blood, the minerals, all of the different vascular systems, nervous system, all of it's working right now for us to even have this conversation. We're spending a little time thinking about that. And what are we thinking about? All of the fanciful thinking we can do and how dramatic we can create experiences to seem to have an impact on people, but the impact is not always that helpful when it's not something we're actually sharing with each other. Harry's describing, you're describing, Anthony, I know you had the experience. To not be able to put words to it is to start to actually concede that it's up to everyone to see for their own experience what that means.
Exactly.
By doing what they can individually, not what we can do for them. Because if I'm doing it for somebody, I'm acting as though they're crippled and unable to do it. And if this thing we're doing is so monumental to our experience, imagine that we can think that we can destroy our life and we can live a life that's so valueless and has so little meaning and has so little potential, and to not at the same time sit still and simply not think that and feel much better.
And to be totally honest, I am still thinking about food. I'm always thinking about food.
Yeah, well, food's a very difficult, when it comes to an obsession, it's very difficult because it's not something we're ever asked to stop doing, right? Alcohol, drugs, there are certain things that when you do them, it causes havoc in your system and actually begs for more, because that the allergic reaction, which is mental, is never going to get enough. So it's always going to need more and more and more and more and more. With food, people are sober from food by beginning to eat responsibly and use it as nourishment rather than taste and flavor and texture. And eating better comes naturally. I mean, I remember in psychology years ago, they did tests with kids.
Yeah.
And they'd give the fruit and vegetables, and the kids would eat the fruit and vegetables that they had slight deficiencies in. They knew their body knows what it needs when they're not completely overwhelmed by this preoccupation of thinking we need to think we're thinking right, when in fact that leads to more wrong thinking to begin with, because the whole thing's corrupt. The whole basis of it is corrupt. But food is obviously a big issue because it's basically the medicine of life is food.
Well, my parents, my dad would say, "You can't be hungry. You just ate." And so I didn't even know as a kid, like, that if I'm hungry or not. It's like, okay, I guess I'm not hungry because you're telling me I'm not hungry. So that's where it starts. You can't be hungry. You're not hungry. You can't be hungry. Did they ever say that to you, Jack?
No, they just gave me the leftovers.
I love you.
I
I didn't
grew up
even
with
know that
6
until I heard
kids.
somebody else share that in a meeting about, like, I didn't even figure that. And somebody else figured that out for me. I'm like, exactly.
So, Anthony, think about that appetite and not being satisfied as one coming from a thought that has no basis. So there's not enough it can ever
Yeah.
consume to fulfill its lack of purpose and its
Scary.
lack of substance.
Scary.
It's only scary when you think it's real.
Nor that it's still happening. It's not old behavior, but it's still happening, Jack.
But the fact, it's like a tightrope walker thinking they should never be out of balance. Think about that. The guy who walks a tightrope
Yeah.
is almost never in balance. They're just in balance enough not to fall. They're going back and forth all the time.
The sales, sorry to interrupt, but the sales guy that I know just told me this. He said, "Can you walk a tightrope right now?" And people say no. And he said, "How about across a building, huge building, hundreds of floors up? Would you walk? No. For $1,000, no. 10,000, no. How about if your kid was on the other side and you had to get to your kid?" It's like, yeah, I could do it, right? It's just all about what's going on, the circumstances. I tried to work that into something for a long time. Was that even close?
Well, I mean, you're trying to remap functional abilities while you're not as busy looking at the absolute capacity we have to begin with. Is the sanity, the natural morality, the natural ethical stance of our actual existence. All of those other things are just manipulations of experience to give us false senses of control. But I would say the things we think of as supernatural aren't supernatural any more than healing is supernatural. Healing is natural in a body. Most of our bodies have cancer cells in it, but the degree to which our body is functioning properly and not being stressed so much that it can't those cells are being managed by the body. They're being taken care of. They're not allowed to flourish because the body is too healthy to allow them to do that. We make ourselves susceptible to it. And I would say it all starts with mental deficiencies, mental conflicts, mental anguish, emotional turmoil as a result. All of that stuff is depressing because it's an implosion. We're stuffing it as though it's not happening into our system. Think about that in relation to food. Eat more, feel better. It doesn't always feel better when you're done.
Yeah.
And yet while you're doing it, it doesn't seem like enough. And then when you're over it, it's like, oh, I ate too much. I don't feel well. We're taxing our bodies, not fueling it with the best value, the best vitamins and proteins and amino acids and all of the different components that make a body healthy, that are all natural. They're all here on this earth. They've all been given to us, and we misuse them. To the degree that we're not thinking correctly, we're doing things that are actually thought to be the only things we can do, and wondering why we're still doing it and kind of slap our head. No, well, it's just me, just the way I am. No,
Hey, at
it's the
least
way
we're
we're
wondering,
thinking.
right? If you're not wondering, then now we got a problem. At least you're wondering. That's a good thing.
Well, it gives some evidence to the fact that we have an awareness that something's
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah, maybe that's a good thing.
Good or bad, if it's happening.
I always want to label everything, right? Your label.
Well, it's within thinking, there are labels. They're called words. And we do take positions. We can take any position we want. When we think we're right, we think it's the only position, meaning nobody else has that same right.
Right, and we
That's a
argue it.
problem.
And we argue it. If we think we're right, we're arguing about it. If we know we're right, we're not arguing.
Well, we already know rightness. If the essence of that essence is the fundamental basis of all life, it has a pretty clear awareness of what's right without even having to be aware of itself. It just knows it.
I like when Harry said that you know more than him, right? You do know. Nobody wants to admit that. Everybody wants to keep saying.
I bet
It
I
felt so
countered.
freeing. I want to say that, right? You know more. I know. I never
Well,
say that.
that's just an excuse you use to act stupid, Anthony. It is. You want to say that so you can think of it as something you can't do because you're not utilizing those things in the discussion while you have the
Well, I don't know if I
opportunity.
had thought about it that much. That would be really overthinking things, Jack.
Doesn't take any overthinking to admit the truth, to admit what's
Ooh, I
actually
like that.
happening.
That's a great slogan.
But as I said to Harry has, like everyone has, the same basis in life. Life is the same for all. It doesn't mean we don't have differing traits and sizes and shapes and colors and all that kind of stuff. But those things are insignificant to the essence of life. The essence of life isn't in color. It isn't in a form. It isn't in time and space. It isn't dimensional. It's just an essence that's whatever it is, seems to have been here as long as this universe has been able to contemplate or actually, or not contemplate, but function and do what it's
Apparently
been doing.
everything. Apparently everything.
So if you have that and we have that and we begin talking about it collectively, we will say things we don't expect that will beyond the imagination we used to think we were limited to because of our reliance on thinking. Our limits were thought of as only what we imagined them to be, which if that wasn't true, that's another lie
Yes.
because we're turning that imagination into limitations, trying to think we
Yes.
can defend them and fight for them, rather than start to see that if imagination is actually based on an absolute infinite source, all of a sudden we'll start imagining things we never had the capacity to even
And
think
you
about.
said start to
Or
see.
expressed.
You said start to see. Right there, you're limited, right? You're like, you'll start to see soon. That's one.
We're talking about human functional capacity in the face of an absolute knowing nature. We can talk about an absolute state and we can think about it all we want. If we're not applying it to our human functional capacity and incapacity, which means dysfunctional thinking and dysfunctional actions, then we're missing the point that it's providing and the opportunity that it's providing to grow and to align with that absolute nature.
You never have your hand up. I like when you're excited. You're fired up, Jack. Let's go. For the viewers, Jack has his hand up a lot.
So if the nature of our nature is natural, and I would say that's the nature of nature, seems to be natural for everything that's on Earth, except for us when we think it isn't, and yet it is. Trees don't argue. They do what they're designed to do. They share the wealth equally, equitably, without discrimination. And if there's a weakness and it gets out of control, it basically disintegrates back into the soil, feeds the next generation of trees.
And the tallest tree, the redwoods, they all hold roots together. You knew that, right? They're all intertwined.
Yeah.
But they live thousands of years.
Yeah. So apparently they've still got something to learn under your theory.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
were you talking to me, right?
Yeah. Always.
No,
Us and about 1,000 people. Us and about 1,000 people, Harry.
Anthony had said that if we live 1,000 years, we would not learn as much, or we
As
would
fast. The reason
too.
that diseases, because I'm like, why don't we live for 5,000 years? Because you would never change. If the humans live for 5,000 years, it would take so long to change anything if there's a problem.
But Anthony, what if there were no problems?
Well, now you're just dreaming.
Well, I would say the dream is the idea that disease is natural.
To dream.
And it may be. I mean, there's certainly a decomposition and a degeneration of bodies that occurs. Transformation, that's natural in this life. The leading cause of death is birth. It's a guarantee for all things that come that it will go into whatever it is, but it basically, the disintegration doesn't literally leave a vacancy. It actually just returns all of the molecules and all of the
I know
essence of that
Jana's ears
sumatomic.
perked up when she heard vacancy. I know our realtors are like, vacancy? Did I hear
I'm
vacancy?
not a realtor. I haven't done that for 6 years.
You are a realtor. You'll always be a realtor. You can't move to Hawaii and say, oh, I'm not a realtor anymore.
It's not the essence of who I am, and I don't discuss it with people ever. I grow bananas.
Sorry.
I like vacant land. I can plant
Yeah,
things
you
on.
are. You only can hold out. You love vacant land. Admit it.
Yeah, I'm all about it. I put bananas on it.
Right.
Avocado
See?
trees. Hawaiian chili peppers. Spinach.
I love that. A realtor is always a realtor.
Oh, all right.
I'm sorry.
I don't think it defined me when I was one. They called me the barefoot realtor and tried to make fun of me when I was number 7 out of 1,800 agents, and I would just laugh.
I know. Did you do your...
I can tell we're getting to the end of this conversation
Or
because
the beginning.
we're going off into occupations.
Well, no, there was a lot of interesting things there because Janice she said she's not a realtor and then went 1 minute later into a story about how people teased her about being the barefoot realtor.
Teased me all the way to the bank, brother.
I love it. That's where I think the people are. I think there's a story. I can't think you just generalize all this stuff. It's like everybody has their own experiences. Whatever Harry happened, he's overcoming those things, and I don't think you could just throw this blanket over everything. I think everybody has a little bit of something. That's my theory.
How do you have to overcome everything when everything is as it is? And
Do you
we're
think they
already
teased
there?
Harry about his name? Like, just the name Harry. Of course, kids are brutal, man. Harry had to overcome 20 years of therapy for the name, right, Harry? Did they ever tease you about your name?
Just ignore him, Harry.
Oh, my name? No, not at all.
Did they ever tease you at all as a kid?
No, not at all.
No kid ever teased you.
No, he'll be in trouble.
Oh my God.
Harry's worthless.
Well, there's the problem. Kids are brutal. They'll tease you about anything, That's how you grow up. Kids that are homeschooled, they don't have that same definition. But so we digress. But if you're going to wrap it up, I want to say thank you, Jack, for being there always. I like to test people. Janet talks about it. You're always solid. You never waver, and it's beautiful. So I apologize publicly, and thank you publicly for being great.
Anthony, I think you're a good example of the impulsive nature that seems uncomfortable in the face of this discussion because it begins to expose those tendencies and you act on them significantly and sufficiently enough to be an example in that regard.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's a statement. And the fact is, facing this, I had a panic attack when I actually started to come to terms with what
Yes.
this meant. And it gripped my body, but it wasn't new and it wasn't old. It was something that I'd been doing so long, thinking I wasn't doing it, that when it finally occurred to me, I started facing what was happening in the present moment that I'd
Just what
always been
Harry
in.
said. That's what Harry said, that he just
Yeah.
said he couldn't do it and he had to change.
So maybe you're seeing that while we think we have different experiences, the essence of our life is the same.
That's what I
And if
said.
that's the case, the inability to describe it would be the ability to reckon with it as something that isn't descriptive. It's not going to ever be reduced to words. Even in the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition, they do not talk about God because it would be sacrilegious to identify an unlimited spirit with an unlimited word. So they created another word to suggest the spirit without it being the word God. Yahweh, I think, is the word that was created. I don't know the whole history of that, but I know that the essence of that is that you can't consolidate an absolute nature within a word, because the word does nothing more than simply reference it. And all of the words we're using are going to come out of all of our mouths in different ways. But if the essence we all have is the same, we will know when people speak that knowingness that we share, regardless of how it's said, regardless of the process that they went through and the way that they speak. We all have different vocabularies. We choose different words. We choose the connotation and definition of words differently. That is our prerogative and an absolute right that we have. Yet we know, like you're mentioning, when you hear it and know it, you know it. Person doesn't have to be speaking in your words any more than the words I use should be the words you use. They're not. I'm only posing a challenge to the vocabulary we use to start to look at the dysfunctional nature of it, when in fact it is making these conclusions we think are absolutely right, when in fact, if there's any doubt whatsoever, it's going to be revealed in the uncertainty of even speaking that, which would become reactive and impulsive and compulsive as a result. So that reactivity is somewhat of a telling sign. And I do it every day to some degree. There's always something I'm quick to respond to or quick to react to. Sometimes it's an observation.
Which we're all happy about because it makes us relate to our humanness. But the essence of what we are is incorruptible.
Yeah, exactly. So think about, we have ideas about our humanness, Jana, that we think are corruptible, when in fact it's all been delusional that we thought they were corruptible. We've been it's kind of like we've been eating poison and we wonder why we keep getting sick and we keep eating more poison. So food for thought, when it's toxic, is going to give us impressions about human life that aren't true.
Hey, food for thought. Where's that from? And is it incorruptible or uncorruptible, Jana?
Say my name correctly and you might get
Jana, right? That's exactly Jana.
Look it up, Anthony. You got a dictionary.
Uncorruptible, I already know.
Well, look it up. No, I think it's incorruptible. But it doesn't, the point is, it doesn't matter how it's said. The point is that there is corruption in the process. There is immorality in the process when we make believe what we think is reality. We're setting the stage for a vicious cycle of fractured states, mental states that are all, by the way, delusional. So to begin to see delusions as nothing more than we make of them is to begin to see that we are the makers of them when we are suffering that fear. And to begin to acknowledge that will be the opportunity to face them without fear, and that fear will dissolve quickly. Because rather than complement them with more and more thinking about it, thinking we're going to get away, thinking we need to defend and protect and hide more, which is causing it, we'll start to look at it honestly and feel it when we do. Just like if you admit your house is on fire, you're probably going to feel the heat. And the best thing to do is say, okay, probably not going to put it out standing here. Maybe I can do something better. Maybe I can act in a way that would become more aligned with the nature of nature. So that fear and all that can feel consuming, because it's all we narrow our focus down to and think, like putting my hand in front of my face, all I can see is a hand, and thinking the world and the universe has become 5 fingers in a palm. It's a choice. We can do that. We're free to do that. When you begin to realize when you're doing what you're doing, Harry, this and you included in this, when you're seeing that stuff, when you realize you're free to do that, my experience is whenever I work with somebody and they get to that point, they say, well, that would be crazy. Why would I ever do that? And that tends to be the turning point of starting to see the option. Because if you had no option, you wouldn't consider what you were doing as a choice. You would consider it as an instinct and built into your DNA and something you can do absolutely nothing about. Ironically, the things we can do nothing about, we don't think about at all until they're severely wrong. Disease is a good example. It grows and grows and grows before people are aware of it because they become so desensitized in their experience that they're not paying attention to what's happening. And again, doesn't have to apply to everybody's experience in exactly the way I just said it. But the point is, if we're denying what's happening and operating on a basis as though what isn't happening is happening, we are imposing a level of stress on our body that undermines its ability to do what it does naturally. All of those trillions of interactions chemically that it's doing momentarily at every moment, always on our behalf, and not noticing that we are having a corruptible impact on it, just as we have had as humans on the planet. To whatever degree we've been corrupt in our thinking, we've been corrupting the nature of nature, making believe it's the only thing that we can do because we need more and more and more of it to satisfy the emptiness of the thinking we're doing that has no basis whatsoever in reality. It's delusional. It's literally induced insanity. Nothing more, nothing less. To take it so seriously as to think it's us is to become very, very serious about the life we think we're leading. When in fact, it's laughable to think something so simple as thinking about a thought as reality could be causing it all. When you begin to notice the simplicity of this, it will become laughable that you ever took it seriously. And I think Harry is good witness to that because he's looked at it honestly, and he was suffering. He was struggling when I talked to him. He was sent by a friend, another friend that I work with years back. And he had no experience, by the way, in sobriety or any of that stuff. Some of us have been in sobriety. We've been exposed to some of the methodology of starting to come to terms with what's actually happening. He did not have that, but he responded very quickly. And my experience is when people are ready, they see. And when they look for what's actually happening, they find very quickly and immediately. It's when we're looking at questionably trying to continue to manufacture the idea that I can only do so much and I'm just limited and all I am is a human. That is not true. We are not just humans. We have human bodies. We are life forms in terms of our body. Our body is part of the brain is part of the body. So if you think of this in relation to the first step in Alcoholics Anonymous or any of the 12 steps, the powerless isn't about the drug, the alcohol, the relationship, the food. It isn't about those things, the gambling, the sex. It's not about those things. It's about the thought about those things, that I can do it without any consequence and I can control it and I can enjoy it and I can do it normally. What would normal be? I can take it or leave it. When you can't take it or leave it, you're operating on the basis of a thought thought to be real that isn't real. And it will the summation of that is going to cause this manifestation. And the manifestation is the education we're asking for by doing that thing. And to chronically do it over and over and over again as though it needs to be repeated is like going back to college for 30 years because you never want to open the textbook. The functional literacy of our body language is the textbook, the manual, the owner's manual, the operating manual for our experience here on Earth. And if we were acting according to that loving, absolute nature, we would have so much more than we would ever want because we would want very little, making sure that everyone else had enough too, naturally. That's how nature works. That's what we're designed to do. It's not necessarily how we're functioning today. So I love you guys.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Jack. That was amazing and beautiful as you are. I love you.
Love you too, Jenna.
Okay, bye. Thank you
Thanks,
for
Jack.
everything
Bye, everyone.
always.
See you all. Thank you, Harry, Anthony, Gabe.
Thank you, Jack.